the sky open up as you ascend into realms no living person has ever returned to describe. This is not the stuff of fantasy. It is a story preserved in the oldest records of humanity, woven into the fabric of the Bible and echoed in Ethiopian traditions that claim to hold forgotten truths hidden from the rest of the world. These two figures, Elijah and Enoch, are remembered not as ordinary men, but as witnesses to a mystery that challenges the way we think about life, death, and what may exist beyond the grave. Their ascensions are like cracks in the veil that separates heaven from earth, windows into a reality where death does not have the final word. To understand their stories, we must first step back from our ordinary way of thinking. Today, science chases immortality through technology, medicine, and theories of life extension. Billionaires fund research into prolonging youth, and entire industries thrive on the human desire to escape aging. Yet thousands of years before modern laboratories or futuristic dreams, two men are said to have achieved something far greater. They did not simply live long lives. They were carried directly into the presence of God. Their very existence becomes a question mark placed against the certainty of human mortality. The first of these men, Enoch, appears in the earliest chapters of Genesis, at a time when the world was still raw and untamed. He is described as a man who walked so closely with God that one day he was no longer found among the living. The words are brief, almost elusive, and Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. That short line holds within it a world of wonder. No details of illness, no funeral, no return to dust, just an unexplainable departure. In later writings, especially in the Ethiopian tradition preserved in the Book of Enoch, his story is expanded, painting him as a man entrusted with visions of heaven, secrets of the angels, and glimpses of divine judgment. It is as if he was taken away because earth could no longer contain the knowledge he carried. The second figure is Elijah, a prophet who lived centuries later, during a time of corruption, idolatry, and the struggle of Israel to remain faithful. Elijah's life was fiery, filled with confrontations against kings and false prophets. But his end, or rather his transition, is unlike anything seen in Scripture. He does not die quietly in bed or fall to the sword of his enemies. Instead, his disciple Elisha witnesses him being lifted up into the heavens by a whirlwind, accompanied by a chariot and horses of fire. One moment, Elijah was walking the dusty road of earth, and the next he was gone, swallowed by the sky in a blaze of glory. For Elisha, it must have been both terrifying and breathtaking, watching a human body depart the realm of mortality in a storm of divine fire. What unites the stories of these two men is not just their escape from death, but the mystery of why they were chosen. Why Enoch? Why Elijah? Were they preserved for a purpose beyond their own lifetimes? Some traditions suggest they were taken as witnesses to return in the final days, testifying once more before humanity at the climax of history. Others believe their ascensions are symbols of hope, that human beings were never meant for death, but for life everlasting, and these two are living proof of that hidden promise. The Ethiopian Bible, with its 88 books, holds these stories with a weight and reverence often lost in Western traditions. It does not treat them as side notes or mere curiosities, but as essential threads in the story of God's dealings with humanity. Within these ancient texts, Elijah and Enoch are not forgotten. They are remembered as men who remind us that death is not the only doorway. And when we turn to the Book of Enoch, preserved in Ethiopia for centuries while excluded from most Western canons, the veil lifts even higher. There, Enoch's heavenly journey is described in detail, his visions of the throne of God, the secrets of creation, the ranks of angels, and the fate of both righteous and wicked souls. Reading it feels like standing on the threshold of heaven itself, guided by the footsteps of a man who never died. When we think of immortality today, we think of science fiction or far-off dreams. But for the people who preserved these stories, immortality was not a dream, it was history. Enoch and Elijah were not inventions, but real figures whose lives broke the pattern of birth, life, and death. They stand as exceptions that demand explanation, and in that demand, they push us to consider, what if humanity's destiny is greater than the grave? What if the breath within us was never meant to be extinguished? In many cultures, stories of gods, heroes, or sages ascending to the heavens exist. The Egyptians told of pharaohs joining the sun god Ra, while Greeks spoke of Hercules rising to Olympus. But what makes the stories of Elijah and Enoch different is that they are not mythic embellishments. They are presented as factual accounts in sacred history, grounded not in imagination, but in testimony. These two men were flesh and blood, just as we are, yet their ends defy the law that governs every human life. This is where the story begins. A story of two men who escaped the shadow of death, carried into eternity, leaving behind a mystery that has stirred hearts and minds for millennia. Their ascensions are not just about them. They are about us, about what it means to be human, and about the possibility that life on this earth is only the beginning. And so, as we set out on this journey together, I invite you to think not only about what happened to Elijah and Enoch, but about what their stories mean for you and for me. Could it be that within these ancient accounts lies a truth that has been overlooked, hidden, or even forgotten by history? A truth that whispers of a life that death cannot touch? Before we continue deeper into the mystery of these two men who never died, I want to pause for a moment to speak directly to you. If you find these stories as powerful and thought-provoking as I do, I encourage you to become part of our growing community here at Bible Says. Hit that subscribe button and help us reach our goal of 10,000 subscribers. Share this video with your friends so that more people can rediscover the forgotten treasures of Scripture. If you'd like to support this work even further, you can use the Super Thanks button to contribute financially, helping us bring more of these hidden stories to light. And I'd love to know more about you. Tell me in the comments your name, your city, and the time you're watching this video. It's a way of reminding ourselves that across the world, people are uniting in the search for truth. And finally, for those who want to go deeper, to hold the ancient words in their own hands, check the description below. There you will find the link to the Complete Bible with 88 books and the Book of Enoch in English. These texts are not just history, they are living voices from the past, waiting to speak to you today. This is where our story begins, with Elijah and Enoch, two men who never died, and the mystery of their hidden ascensions into the heavens. The ancient world was a place of conflict as well as beginnings. Human decisions there shaped future generations' destinies and established patterns. It is crucial to visualize the type of world that Enoch and Elijah lived in prior to their remarkable ascensions in order to comprehend their lives. Both men were born into lost societies where idolatry, violence, and corruption were the norm rather than the exception. Their faithfulness stood out like a single flame in the midst of a storm because of the spiritual gloom that characterized their times. Enoch lived in what are known as the pre-Great Flood days, which are considered to be the earliest chapters of human history. During these generations, human disobedience had already tarnished the world which had just been created. Adam and Eve's descendants had dispersed throughout the planet, establishing cities, families, and hierarchies. However, as they grew, they also became conceited, greedy, and their relationship with God gradually deteriorated. According to the scriptures, there was a lot of violence in the world. People were consumed by their own desires, and it became harder to distinguish between what was divine and what was human. It was a time when corrupt practices permeated every aspect of human existence, and powerful leaders rose to prominence and claimed it for themselves. Enoch was born during this time. His life embodied the meaning of his name, which was dedicated. Enoch was not tempted by the burgeoning culture of rebellion, in contrast to many of his contemporaries. He was surrounded by individuals who prioritized pleasure, power, and self-interest over respect for their Creator, but he made a different decision. Enoch sought a closer relationship with God as the world grew more violent and unfair. He was unique because of this decision, both during his lifetime and in the everlasting record of Scripture. There is a stark contrast between one man walking faithfully with God and an entire generation heading toward destruction. This image is elaborated upon in even more detail in the Ethiopian tradition's Book of Enoch. It talks about fallen angels known as watchers who came to earth and gave people access to knowledge that was forbidden to them. They fostered violence and idolatry by teaching the secrets of weaponry, enchantments, and vanity. Unnatural unions produced giants who terrorized the world. People became more corrupt as a result of their fascination with power and their attraction to evil. Given heavenly visions and judgmental warnings, Enoch emerged as a voice of truth in this context. He was selected to demonstrate the gravity of the world situation and to bear witness that despite humanity's impending doom, God had not abandoned his creation. Despite being centuries apart, Elijah's world shared many characteristics with Enoch's, including decay and rebellion. The country of Israel had been established by the time of Elijah, with temples devoted to God standing in the land and kings ruling from their thrones. Nevertheless, the people rejected the covenant in spite of all these advantages. They bowed before idols of stone and wood, chasing after the gods of neighboring nations, Asherah, Baal, and others, forgetting the one who had saved them. This disloyalty was frequently spearheaded by the monarchs themselves, who used their authority to stifle prophets and promote the worship of false gods. At the highest echelons of society, idolatry was prevalent during Elijah's time. King Ahab persecuted God's prophets and built altars to Baal as a result of Queen Jezebel's influence. The nation's religious life was impacted by Jezebel's influence, which caused people to turn their backs on the truth. Once called to be a light to the world, the Israelites were now torn between compromise and faithfulness. Instead of believing in the invisible God of their fathers, many people followed the promises of fertility, rain, and prosperity made by rituals to false gods. Elijah's faith was not only out of the ordinary in such a setting, but also dangerous. He opposed kings, Baal priests, and a society that derided the concept of allegiance to a single God. Elijah's and Enoch's worlds are similar in that they both experienced pervasive corruption. The world was rife with violence during Enoch's time, and people were losing their hold on morality and getting ready for the flood's judgment. The chosen nation of Israel was becoming less distinct during Elijah's time, fusing its religious devotion with heathen rites and customs. Faith was lacking in both contexts. The truth was hidden beneath layers of idolatry and deceit, and most had chosen their own paths. Given this context, it is even more significant that God chose them. Enoch was picked because he stayed faithful in a world where faith had all but disappeared, not because he was flawless. At a time when most people turned away from God, he walked with him. When people's hearts were taken by idols, Elijah was chosen to stand resolutely against a wave of compromise and call them back to the covenant. Both men turned into living representations of God's faithfulness, serving as a reminder that God always raises up voices that cannot be silenced, even in the most dire circumstances. The significance of their ascensions is also revealed by the corruption of their worlds. As if God had lifted him out before judgment, Enoch was taken before the flood destroyed the ancient world. His departure served as a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, there is hope and life after death. As evidence that idolatry cannot lessen God's power, Elijah was taken from the land in a fiery chariot during Israel's uprising. In addition to being a reward for his loyalty, his ascension served as a reminder that even when nations and kings submit to deception, divine truth always prevails. Both men serve as a reminder that the faithful few, not the majority, influence God's decisions. One life given up in loyalty can shine brighter than the rest, even though entire populations may turn their backs. Elijah's fiery stand and Enoch's relationship with God are examples of how God's faithfulness is independent of the state of the world. It hinges on people's determination to stand their ground in the face of corruption. It is simple to understand why their ascensions are significant when we consider their eras. They were not regular men going about their daily lives. They lived in times when deceit was praised, truth seemed brittle, and sin seemed to reign supreme. Yet as the world around them fell apart, God selected them as living witnesses of a higher reality, men who were carried alive into the heavens. The state of the earth they left behind is inextricably linked to the tale of their ascents. Enoch saw it as a world on the verge of collapsing due to its own bloodshed. Elijah saw it as a country on the verge of disintegrating due to its own idolatry. Both instances demonstrate how grave the times were, as evidenced by their removal from the planet. Their lives served as a reminder that God still sees those who walk with him, and that faithfulness is possible even in the face of widespread corruption. These men were brought up not only to oppose their generation, but also to serve as a reminder of the price and benefits of faith to all succeeding generations. We notice a pattern in them. God calls out people to spread his truth when the world becomes lost. He calls out those who will not compromise when people seek violence or idols. And through those who live obediently, he offers glimpses of eternity. Just when history appears poised to fall apart due to its own corruption, their times serve as a reminder that idolatry and corruption are not merely archaic issues. These themes have appeared repeatedly throughout human history. However, God's decision to elevate truthful voices and individuals who stand out due to their faith rather than their strength is also an example. And it is because of these individuals that humanity's history retains hope, even during the most dire circumstances. Almost like a whisper, Enoch is a fleeting but memorable character whose life speaks louder than countless words could. He is referred to as the seventh from Adam, which is a straightforward yet profound description. The Bible is filled with references to divine order, and the number 7 is the number of completion. Enoch had a special place because he was the 7th in line of humanity's earliest generations, a sign that his life would represent something complete in its devotion to God. Even though Genesis only contains a few lines of his story, it has endured as a testament to what it means to walk with God. He was neither a supernatural being beyond human comprehension, nor an angel. Living in a world that had already strayed far from Eden's purity, Enoch was a man with a family. He was born into a time when men celebrated their power, wealth, and independence from the Creator, and rebellion had become the norm. It was difficult to walk with God in such a setting. It required fighting the urge to fit in with the crowd, the pull of society, and the attraction of worldly pleasures. Enoch's devotion was a daily decision that required bravery and perseverance. It was not passive. According to Genesis, Enoch walked with God. Then he was no more because God took him. The message is profound, despite the sparseness of the words. Walking with God implies a closeness that transcended ceremonial observance or external compliance. It was a bond, a friendship, a way of living so in harmony with the Creator that it seemed impossible to distinguish between heaven and earth. In order to walk with God, Enoch had to seek His presence constantly, rely on Him for guidance, and trust Him at every turn. It wasn't an easy walk, but it was one of loyalty, and loyalty always has its challenges. In order to humanize Enoch, we must see him as a man who shares our current worries rather than as a distant character. He had obligations, a wife, and kids. He provided for his family, worked, and went through the same struggles that all husbands and parents go through. His son Methuselah, who would go on to become the longest living man in the Bible, is named in the book of Genesis. It would have been extremely difficult to raise a child in such a corrupt era. Would Methuselah inherit such a world? How could Enoch shield his family from the idolatry and violence that were all around them? These were the genuine worries of a father who cherished his family and wished to protect them, not just theoretical inquiries. Nevertheless, despite these difficulties, Enoch maintained his faith. According to ancient Ethiopian and Jewish traditions, he was given insights into the mysteries of heaven and the future of humanity, as well as visions from God. Consider the consequences of such disclosures. He saw the impending judgment, the angels' fall, and the corruption that would cause the flood. It was difficult to bear such knowledge. It would have been a burdensome burden that separated him from his neighbors and possibly even from his friends and family. Being able to see what others cannot is both a blessing and a source of loneliness. In order to cope with this loneliness, Enoch clung even more tightly to the God who had told him these things. The decision to stay faithful despite hardship was what defined Enoch's purity, not the lack of struggle. He chose the more subdued, more difficult route of obedience during a period when others worshipped idols or exalted violence. He is remembered as a man of faith in Hebrews 11 because of this. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. His devotion was determined by an internal faith that pleased God rather than by external success. His life demonstrates to us that purity is about staying devoted to God in the face of the world, not about escaping it. Enoch's life was also full of struggles because he walked with God. Faith is rarely easy. It is a journey filled with decisions, uncertainties, and questions. Has Enoch ever questioned why God gave him visions of judgment rather than peace? Did he ever worry that his loyalty wouldn't be sufficient to protect his family from the corruption of the outside world? Such inquiries demonstrate humanity rather than weakness. Enoch was unique, not because he didn't have any questions, but rather because he trusted God with the answers and brought all of his questions back to him. His faith was relational, based on trust, and put to the test through hardship. It was not blind. Enoch is portrayed in Ethiopian tradition as a scribe of heaven, a man who became a go-between for God and humanity after recording messages from God. His humanity is enhanced by this image. He was working, writing, and teaching. He wasn't just walking in silence. He developed into a voice that spoke to his generation, warning of the impending judgment and attesting to the possibility of living a truthful life. He would not have been well liked in this role. Voices that challenge their sin are rarely welcomed. Being faithful meant facing rejection, mockery, and possibly even threats. Enoch, however, did not back down. He kept up his faithful walk, his life turning into an endless sermon. His story is so compelling because although he was not exempt from life's hardships, he was raised to a higher plane of reality during those hardships. He lived in such closeness to God that death itself could not take him, even though he was aware of what it was like to feel the weight of accountability, the pain of rejection, and the burden of revelation. His expulsion from this world served as a divine seal on his life, confirming his path. It was as if God pulled him straight into his presence and declared, "This one belongs to me." Enoch's relationship with God serves as a reminder that holiness is about integrating God into every aspect of human experience rather than removing oneself from it. He struggled, worked, loved his family, and did it all with God's help. His secret was that he made every mundane step a part of a sacred journey. Rather than separating the sacred from the everyday, walking with God entails bearing those burdens alongside him, not living a burden-free life. Instead of a myth, we see a man in Enoch's story, a man who bore the burden of an imperfect world, raised children, and resisted temptation. Nevertheless, he made the decision to follow his Creator faithfully. His life was brief in terms of years, particularly when compared to others in his family, but it was full of faith. His walk was measured in the depth of his devotion rather than in centuries. His faithfulness was ultimately rewarded with the greatest mystery. He was carried into the heavens alive rather than dying, a sign of hope for future generations. One of the greatest mysteries in all of Scripture is concealed behind the seemingly straightforward statement that Enoch walked with God, and then he was not, for God took him, that we first hear in Genesis. The narrative is left unresolved in the Bible, virtually tantalizing future generations. It merely states that his life was unique and unlike any man's before him, without explaining how or where he was taken. However, the mystery is not left unsolved by other ancient traditions, particularly those that have been preserved in the Ethiopian Book of Enoch. His travels beyond the world we know, which changed him from a devout man into a divine messenger, are depicted in stunning, vivid detail. According to the writings that have survived in Ethiopia, Enoch was guided gradually into the secrets of heaven rather than being taken by surprise. He was sent angelic guides whose voices echoed like rushing waters and whose presence was luminous like flames. They came to raise him and show him things that no human eye had ever seen, not to frighten him. According to these stories, Enoch is carried upward into worlds that are located far beyond the stars after being raised from the earth, the dust of his feet leaving behind the ground of men. Every heaven he enters is more magnificent than the one before it, full of mysteries, wonders, and manifestations of God's might that are beyond the capacity of mortal language to adequately explain. Angels guarded the boundaries between the earthly and celestial realms, and the first of the heavens that were shown to him was a place of order. They greeted him as a chosen one rather than an intruder. He realized that the universe itself was ordered by divine wisdom when he saw the contrast between chaos and order, between light and darkness. The laws of creation, the designated hours of day and night, the star cycles, and the motions of the sun and moon were all explained by the angels. For Enoch, these were more than astronomical oddities. They were evidence that God's hand was at work in creation, giving it life, direction, and purpose. The second heaven opened up in even more splendor as he ascended higher. He saw fallen spirits who had rebelled long before his time, creatures trapped in the dark. Their chains glowed with the heat of divine judgment, and their cries shook the air like thunder. Enoch was informed that these were once powerful watchers who had deserted their post, corrupted the planet with knowledge that was forbidden, and contributed to the corruption of the planet by rebelling. All of creation was forewarned by their punishment. God's justice may be delayed, but it is never denied. At this vision, Enoch shuddered, not in despair, but in wonder at the holiness of the One in power. Enoch was permitted to see both extremes, paradise and torment, as the journey proceeded into the third heaven. The garden of righteousness, where the faithful people's souls slept beneath the shade of the tree of life, was located on one side. The air was filled with the scent of blossoms, and rivers flowed with crystal-clear waters. Angels served those who had lived chaste lives and were awaiting the ultimate realization of God's promises. The location of judgment, however, where the unrepentant awaited their reckoning, was visible to him on the opposite side. The lesson was obvious. Every decision made on earth had lasting consequences, and the contrast was stark. Enoch witnessed the sun, moon, and stars, the great luminaries, moving in exact order and never deviating from their designated courses in the fourth heaven. He learned about the marking of seasons, the measurement of years, and the divine control over time itself. The angels clarified that the movements of the heavens were not arbitrary, but rather were signs for humanity to recognize and declarations of God's majesty. Walking in the light meant synchronizing with the rhythm of creation, while walking in the dark meant disregarding the order above. Innumerable angelic armies, arranged in ranks like combatants, were visible in the fifth heaven. Their voices blended to create a sound so strong it seemed to tremble the very foundations of reality as they sang hymns of unending praise. However, Enoch also saw exhausted angels, creatures that sang with sorrow rather than joy, as though they were yearning for their own salvation. He was informed that loyalty was important to God and that obedience was put to the test even among the heavenly hosts. Enoch was overcome by the magnitude of what had been revealed by the time he arrived in the sixth heaven. He saw here the angels that watched over the rise and fall of kingdoms and directed the paths of nations. They served as overseers rather than as rulers, making sure that God was aware of everything that occurred in human affairs. Enoch understood that a higher power was at work, giving even human struggles meaning, and that history was not random, that empires did not just rise and fall by accident. Words hardly do it justice when the seventh heaven finally opened before him. The Almighty was surrounded by thrones of burning light, with their wings covering their faces and their voices proclaiming holiness without end. Angelic beings of great glory bowed in unrelenting worship. The great glory, more brilliant than the sun and more radiant than creation itself, was at its core. For a brief moment, Enoch felt more intimately connected to God's heart than any man had ever been after being pulled into this vision. He received knowledge, future secrets, and the certainty that he had been selected to bring a message back from this place. He was not only a visitor, according to the Book of Enoch, but he was also given writings that were inscriptions of the things he had witnessed. He was given the mandate to share these revelations with humanity, to warn, to teach, and to remind them that heaven exists, that judgment is inevitable, and that righteousness is the way to eternal life. These traditions build upon what Genesis says in a single sentence, transforming human perceptions of the invisible world. Enoch was no longer just a man, he was now a witness of heaven itself, a conduit between the divine and the world, and a bearer of unfathomable mysteries. The question, for those who hear his story, is not just what he witnessed, but also why God picked him. Was he pure? His belief, his readiness to live a life distinct from that of others? Maybe it was a combination of these. His travels, however, show that the line separating heaven and earth is not as thick as we may think, and that people who walk with God may see more than others think is possible. In Enoch's tale, immortality means experiencing the fullness of life, the life that exists in the Creator's very presence, rather than avoiding death. In addition to revealing harmony, beauty, and the secrets of creation, Enoch's heavenly travels also made him aware of the darker realities of disobedience and corruption that had crept into the human world. The tale of the Watchers, angels, who were once luminous with glory but fell from their designated positions and abandoned the limits established by God, was one of his most disturbing visions. Instead of protecting humanity, these creatures decided to live out their desires on earth. They distorted creation itself by whispering secrets of heaven into mortal ears and teaching things that were never supposed to be taught. Enoch witnessed the repercussions of their rebellion, which ravaged the ancient world like fire and left wounds on both the earth and the human spirit. The Watchers were leaders of the angelic host, not shadowy, enigmatic spirits. They were unimaginably beautiful, powerful, and influential, but as the Ethiopian Book of Enoch tells us, their hearts were ablaze with lust, and they detested the daughters of men. They all took an oath to take wives from among humanity when they descended to Mount Hermon. This act was a declaration of war against God's order, not just a forbidden passion. They created hybrids known in the Bible as Nephilim, beings who were neither entirely human nor entirely angelic, by uniting with mortals. Giants with enormous size and terrifying strength were the Nephilim. They ruled the planet, enslaving people, consuming resources, and inciting violence. Their physical and spiritual presence represented corruption and an unintended blending of the divine and the human. According to old legends, they terrorized every area they visited by eating not just animal flesh, but also human flesh. Bloodshed became the hallmark of their rule. Villages shuddered at their presence, and kingdoms were powerless to oppose them. A nightmare had replaced what had once been the beauty of creation. However, the uprising continued. Additionally, the Watchers gave humanity access to secrets that upset the natural order of things. Some turned men into their own killers by teaching them the art of war and crafting iron weapons and sharpened blades. Others disclosed charms, enchantments, and the use of herbs to perform magic. Others taught adornments and cosmetics that stoked lust and vanity. In reality, what appeared to be gifts of progress were actually chains that held people to sin and ruin. Men and women were drawn away from their Creator into idolatry, greed, and never-ending conflict by this knowledge, which was imparted in deception rather than wisdom. In his visions, Enoch was selected to face these horrors in addition to witnessing them. He was given instructions by God to serve as a messenger to both humanity and the fallen angels. Consider how difficult it would be for a mortal man to stand in front of powerful beings as the voice of divine judgment. Enoch, however, did not decline. According to one story, the angels took him into the prisons where the Watchers were held because they were afraid of their impending judgment. These once proud creatures pleaded with him to speak up for them, to make a plea to God. Their pride was broken, their faces were dejected, and their voices were desperate. They hoped that they would also receive mercy, and that their disobedience would be pardoned in some way. Enoch must have felt the conflict between justice and compassion as he heard their cries. Being flesh himself, he was aware of the weakness of temptation and the allure of desire. He had witnessed the destruction their actions had wrought on the world, but he also stood before the Almighty. He swiftly and firmly responded that there would be no forgiveness when he brought their requests before God. The Watchers had gone too far. A flood would wipe out the corruption they had propagated. Their descendants, the Nephilim, would perish, and their fate was set. Enoch felt the weight of this realization because it meant that the Watchers would not be the only ones to suffer. The impending judgment would also apply to humanity. Although men had been misled, their decisions had contributed to the destruction, and the earth was now tainted with blood and violence. As a prophet, Enoch forewarned the people of what lay ahead. In addition to being a dire warning, his words also served as a call to repentance and a reminder to return to righteousness before it was too late. His voice carried the echo of mercy, a reminder that God's justice always comes with a chance for the faithful to endure, even though the flood was unavoidable. He learned from the visions that the flood would both purify and reset creation. Even though the giants would be exterminated and their bodies destroyed, Their violent and restless spirits would continue to torment humanity for all eternity as they roamed the earth as unclean spirits. Not entirely human nor angelic, these disembodied entities would grow into the seeds of future temptation, inciting men to act violently, lustfully, and rebelliously. As a result, the Watcher's corruption would persist in a different way, casting a shadow over time. Enoch served as a conduit between heaven and earth, bringing the Most High's commands to a world that was only dimly aware of its predicament. He was a man caught between the cries of angels, pleading for forgiveness on one side, and the groans of humanity crushed beneath the weight of sin and violence on the other. He knew that God's heart ached for his creation, but he also saw in his visions that justice had to win out. His mission was characterized by this harmony between justice and compassion. He was selected to proclaim a flood that would change the course of the earth's history. So he was not just an observer, but an active participant. Beyond merely being an old legend, the tale of the Watchers and the Nephilim serves as a cautionary tale about the perils of unbridled desire and the abuse of knowledge. It demonstrates how distorted power can corrupt entire generations in addition to individuals. The character of Enoch in this story demonstrates a God who, even in the face of impending judgment, speaks up to proclaim the truth rather than remaining silent in the face of corruption. The memory of these visions would endure, preserved in the writings ascribed to Enoch, and carried through time as both history and prophecy, even though the flood would arrive, eradicating the giants and purifying the land. Scripture and tradition serve as a reminder that every decision we make, whether it be human or angelic, has long-term effects. Horrors were unleashed when the Watchers chose to rebel. Humanity's decision to use violence resulted in devastation. Nevertheless, one man was selected to stand, see, and speak the words of God in the midst of everything. One of the most profound accounts of how the invisible world influences human destiny and serves as a reminder that heaven keeps a close eye on the earth is found in Enoch's visions of the Watchers and the Nephilim. Enoch's visions did not conclude with dire predictions about the Watchers and the destruction of their progeny. Since many traditions, particularly in Ethiopian and Jewish writings, maintain that Enoch was changed into something far greater than mortal men had ever been, his story did not end with him being taken away in mystery. Rather, it became even more profound. Enoch is described as being carried not only into the heavens, but into a role that is beyond human understanding. A man transformed into an angelic being, known in some traditions as Metatron. In this transformation, which is hinted at in ancient texts, a deep mystery is revealed by the straightforward statement in Genesis that God took him. What happens when a person who is so devoted and faithful is fully admitted into the councils of heaven? Enoch is described as having ascended not only as a guest, but also as someone appointed to an eternal office in Jewish mystical writings, especially in texts that later developed within the traditions of the Merkava mystics. He was transformed into a celestial being with unparalleled power and authority, leaving behind the weak man who used to walk with his family. He was dressed in garments of glory, and his flesh, which was tied to mortality, was stripped away. He was surrounded by light, and he was filled with fire. He was transformed from Enoch the seventh of Adam to Metatron, the prince of the presence, who now sits next to God's throne. This exaltation is echoed in Ethiopian traditions. He was already distinguished in the Book of Enoch by the visions he received, but subsequent interpretations recognized his function as more than just a prophet. He was appointed the scribe of heaven and given the responsibility of documenting all human and angelic actions. He was tasked with recording all acts of obedience and disobedience and maintaining the divine order in writing. In this capacity, He served as a judge as well as a witness, and his writing bore the weight of eternity. Being selected for such a position meant that his humanity was enhanced rather than diminished, becoming something that served as a link between the world and the heavens. Despite its enigma, Metatron's title connotes his strength and closeness to God. He is referred to as the Lesser YHWH in some stories, not because he was divine in and of himself, but rather because he carried God's name and authority in his work. Even though he had been mortal before, his metamorphosis made him the most powerful member of the celestial host, and angels shuddered before him. He served as the go-between for divine decrees, sitting on a throne that had been prepared for him next to the throne of glory. In this picture, Enoch is portrayed as a key player in the continuous governance of creation, rather than as a man lost to history. This change has profound implications for humanity. The potential that God sees in people is made clear by Enoch's elevation. Enoch's greatness was the result of devotion, obedience, and faith, in contrast to the angels who were created in splendor. From the beginning, unlike the Watchers, he ascended via righteousness and humility rather than strength or rebellion. Humanity was never intended to exist on dust alone, as evidenced by his metamorphosis into Metatron. There is a way up that leads to communion and even involvement in the divine order. This mystery highlights the worth of people because they are created in God's image and can rise to a glory that even angels recognize through faithfulness. Enoch's role as a heavenly scribe was both amazing and terrifying. The burden of memory itself was intended to be carried by documenting the acts of creation. Every cruel deed, every kind word, and every heartfelt secret were all written down by him. His writings were preserved in heavenly archives, and he received visions of earthly events from angels of fire. The notion that Enoch became the author of the Book of Life emphasizes the gravity of his position in Jewish mystical tradition. Man's actions were recorded in the books of eternity and were no longer transient. The idea that a man could perform such a duty elevates the story of Enoch above mere myth. It becomes a living example of responsibility and a reminder that nothing is above heaven's watchful eye. However, Enoch's metamorphosis also made him a judge of angels as well as of people. This is a startling reversal. Angels, creatures of splendor and strength, used to regard humans with lust and disdain. Enoch, who had once been a mortal, was now seated to sit in judgment over those same celestial beings. It would now be evident to the fallen Watchers who had pleaded with him to present their case before God that the person to whom they appealed had been elevated well above their station. The image of the faithful man being raised while the disobedient angels are cast down is a representation of divine justice. Those who once boasted of power are being replaced by the meek. The story of Enoch's metamorphosis struck a deep chord with Ethiopian Christians who kept the Book of Enoch as a sacred text long after Western traditions rejected it. They saw Enoch's elevation as a premonition of Christ's promise to ascend into heaven and sit at God's right hand. They saw Enoch as a type, a personification of God's plan for humanity, which was one of elevation rather than destruction. His tale became a beacon of hope, demonstrating that the earth's dust could be transformed into eternal light and that mortality could be wrapped in immortality. Metatron's proximity to the divine name was one of the mysteries surrounding him. According to some stories, Enoch received 70 names after his transformation, each of which represented a facet of divine authority. He evolved into the teacher of secrets, the angel of wisdom, and the counselor of souls. His words reverberated with the authority of the Almighty, and his voice carried weight in heavenly councils. He was still known as Enoch, the man who once walked with God, despite his elevated status. This recollection made sure that his metamorphosis was never interpreted as erasure, but rather as fulfillment, the pinnacle of faith's destiny. Those who thought about Enoch's story were deeply troubled by the fact that he existed at all as Metatron. What did it mean for the rest of humanity if a man could become so exalted? Was his destiny a one-off occurrence or a sign of what awaited those who pursued faith? Although it isn't stated explicitly, the response seems to linger in the quiet of his tale. His metamorphosis was not only for himself, it was also a symbol and proof of what happens when a person fully gives their life to God. In addition to being a reward, his elevation foretold the eventual unification of heaven and earth. There is also a sense of caution in the texts that explain Enoch's metamorphosis. The watchers fell because they rebelled, just as Enoch rose because he was righteous. Both reached beyond their natural place, but one did so out of obedience and was exalted, while the other did so out of desire and was condemned. This is a stark contrast between the two. This contrast strikes at the core of God's creation plan. Honor comes from humility, not arrogance. Glory is bestowed, not taken. Enoch's ascent to Metatron turns into a mirror held up to humanity, illuminating both the heights and depths to which man can descend. As a result, Enoch's journey from mortal to celestial scribe is more than just an old legend that has been preserved in bits and pieces. It is a testament to God's will to uplift humanity above its weakness and a revelation of destiny. His potential for union with heaven serves as evidence that a mortal can enter the courts of eternity through faith. One of the most amazing mysteries in the entire Bible is the journey of Enoch, from the dust of Adam to the throne next to the Almighty. His metamorphosis reflects not only his personal narrative, but also the greatness that is concealed within the human calling and awaits revelation in the entirety of God's plan. Israel was in one of its darkest periods when Elijah appeared, and the people were torn between their rulers' introduction of idols and their devotion to the living God. Ahab and Jezebel, whose reign was characterized by corruption, Baal worship, and the repression of prophets who continued to uphold Israel's covenant, had an impact on the northern kingdom. Elijah, a man from Tishbe, whose name alone proclaimed a truth the country had forgotten, "My God is Yahweh," entered this climate of fear and compromise. His mission was not one of tactful persuasion or diplomacy, but rather of a direct, uncompromising call to faithfulness. His words pierced complacency like fire through dry straw, and he challenged the religious establishment and kings. His message served as a reminder that only the God of Israel had authority over the earth and the heavens, and that no idol could bring rain, fertility, or life. Elijah did not shudder in front of the throne or speak warily as someone begging for forgiveness when he stood in front of Ahab. Rather, he declared a drought, a divine retribution that would reveal the frailty of the so-called storm god Baal. This was a direct challenge to the core of Canaanite religion, as well as a prophecy. Let Baal bring forth the rain, if he was the source of it. Elijah's words caused the heavens to close, and the land started to wilt under the weight of God's silence. It was a harsh act of judgment, but it was also a mercy, removing illusions and demonstrating the vulnerability of false faith in the face of reality. From ravens bringing him bread and meat to a poor widow whose jar of flour and jug of oil refused to run dry, Elijah himself became a vagrant for years, living off of miraculous provisions rather than plenty. He was being formed in his concealment, his faith put to the test in the quiet of the drought, and he was getting ready for the day when he would stand not only before a king, but also in front of a whole country. His prophetic mission peaked on Mount Carmel, where the struggle between deceit and truth culminated. Elijah, surrounded by the prophets of Baal and a hesitant populace, posed a challenge that would definitively resolve the issue. Whichever god responded with fire, that God alone would be God. An altar was rebuilt, a sacrifice was made, and water was repeatedly poured until the trench overflowed, creating a dramatic scene. Heaven was silent while the prophets of Baal screamed, slashed themselves, and danced in despair. Since their God didn't exist, he couldn't hear. Elijah's prayer, on the other hand, was succinct, straightforward, and based on faith rather than spectacle. Answer me, O Lord, so these people will know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. Fire fell, devouring not only the sacrifice but also the stones, the water, and the dust. It was a manifestation of divine reality, a consuming fire that dispelled skepticism and eliminated all possibility of deceit. "The Lord, He is God," the crowd exclaimed as they collapsed to the ground. However, Elijah's tale is not just one of success. Elijah found himself the target of Jezebel's retaliation, following the Carmel fire, the silencing of the prophets of Baal, and the return of the rains. The prophet, who had previously stood unfazed by kings, was driven into the wilderness by her threats, where he was overcome by fear and despair. Persuaded that his mission was over and that he was no better than his ancestors, he prayed for death beneath the broom tree. The prophet's fire appeared to have been extinguished in this moment of unadulterated humanity, where bravery gave way to fatigue. However, God did not desert him there either. He was urged to get up and eat by an angel who brought him bread and water because the journey was not yet complete. Fortified, he journeyed to Mount Horeb, the mountain of divine encounter, where he sought answers in the soft whisper that revealed God's presence in silence rather than in thunder, fire, or earthquake. Elijah was reminded by this encounter that God's power was demonstrated not only through spectacular fire from heaven, but also through the silent persistence of his voice, which marked a turning point in his life. Elijah felt isolated because he thought he was the only prophet who remained faithful, but God showed him that thousands of Israelites had refused to bow to Baal. He was never alone in the mission. He was a part of a greater narrative that went beyond his own life. He appointed Elisha to carry on the prophetic work, so even his role would change. Instead of disqualifying him from God's plan, his moments of weakness made him more relatable by demonstrating that even those called to boldness struggle with fear and despair. The conflict between fire and fragility is reflected in Elijah's journey. He demonstrated to the nation that only God is in control by standing as a prophet of fire and using divine authority to combat falsehood. Conversely, he was a man who understood loneliness, isolation, and the weight of truth in a world that was skewed toward dishonesty. His narrative shows that faith is not the absence of fear, but rather the bravery to act despite it, and that God provides his servants with strength beyond their own when hopelessness seems insurmountable. Elijah's calling down of fire is still remembered as one of the most striking examples of prophetic power, but his subsequent life is equally instructive. The lesson of the whisper at Horeb is that the same God who responds with consuming flames also works subtly and in ways that are just as potent despite being quiet. Prophets are human beings who carry the weight of divine messages in delicate vessels, as demonstrated by Elijah's struggles. His legacy included not only the altar he set on fire, but also the bravery to continue walking through silence and the wilderness. A scene so dramatic and enigmatic that it has reverberated for centuries as one of the most memorable moments in Scripture opens the last chapter of Elijah's earthly mission. The prophet who stood unflinching in the face of false prophets' armies and kings, who summoned fire from heaven to devour an altar, was destined to depart this world in a blaze of divine glory. Elijah's departure would serve as a living example that God's power could raise a man above mortality, in contrast to others who faced death's inevitable conclusion. Elijah knew his time was coming, so the story starts with a journey. He didn't keep this knowledge to himself, and he didn't spend his last hours alone. Instead, he walked with his disciple Elisha, testing his loyalty at each stage of the path, as if ensuring that the one who would carry his mantle was ready for the weight it bore. Elijah repeatedly urged Elisha to stay with him from Gilgal to Bethel, Bethel to Jericho, and finally to the Jordan. But Elisha insisted, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." The actual trip was rich in symbolism, with remnants of Israel's past present at every stop, reminding prophet and disciple of previous crossings that had signaled pivotal moments in God's people's history, from Joshua leading the tribes into the Promised Land to the miraculous parting of waters under divine command. Crossing the Jordan River was more than just a physical act. It was a spiritual declaration. Elijah grabbed his mantle at the Jordan's edge, rolled it up, and hit the river to split its waters, allowing him and Elisha to cross on dry land. It served as a reminder that Elijah's authority was that of the Lord, not himself, and that it could be transferred. After crossing, Elijah asked his disciple one last time, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?" Elisha made no requests for fame, fortune, or security during the tumultuous years to come. In a daring plea for the ability to serve as obediently and fearlessly as his master had, he asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit rather than power. Elijah acknowledged that the request was unusual, but he did not reject it. Only divine will, not human grant, could bring about such a portion. He assured Elisha that the request would be granted if he saw him leave. This circumstance prepared the way for what transpired, a scene in which heaven and earth met in a way that is difficult for words to describe. The sky suddenly opened up in a blaze of fire as they were walking and conversing. Between them, master and disciple were separated by a chariot of flame, drawn by horses that were as blazing as lightning. Elijah was raised from the ground in a tornado of wind and fire. The prophet swallowed in glory, without ever tasting the death that devours all flesh. There was no gradual fading, no final embrace, only the abrupt rupture of the ordinary by the extraordinary. Elisha stood speechless, his heart divided between amazement and sorrow, his eyes straining to take in the scene. "My father!" he exclaimed. "My dad! Israel's horsemen and chariots!" In addition to saying goodbye, he acknowledged that Elijah had been more than just a man and a prophet. More powerful than any army or monarch, he was Israel's true defender. Elisha felt as though the country itself had been weakened by his departure. Elisha tore his garments in grief as the flaming chariot disappeared into the sky, demonstrating how deeply he had bonded with the person who had served as his mentor, spiritual father, and guide. However, he was not immobilized by grief because Elijah's mantle had fallen to the ground. Elisha took it in his hands, the emblem of prophetic power now in his possession. Accepting the mantle was a confirmation, not just an inheritance. The prophets who had been observing from afar said, "The spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha." Elijah's influence had not diminished, but rather increased as a result of his fiery ascension. Elisha returned to the Jordan, struck the waters, as Elijah had, and when they parted for him as well. His departure served as the catalyst for his mission to be carried out by someone who had shared his spirit and seen his glory. In this sense, Elijah's story was not a conclusion, but rather a change, a transition from the flame of one prophet to another. Elijah's ascension has deep symbolic meaning. He became a living example of God's dominion over mortality because he never died. Elijah is one of only two biblical characters whose lives were not terminated by death, the other being Enoch, who was said to have walked with God and was no more because God took him. He was unique because of this, and subsequent generations of Israelites carried with them the expectation that he would return at some point. This expectation was only increased by Malachi's prediction that Elijah would return before the great and terrible day of the Lord. His fiery departure served as a reminder that God's work in history was not yet finished and was not just a past occurrence. This is why later events, like when Jesus is transfigured on the mountain and is seen speaking to Moses and Elijah, both of whom are standing as witnesses to divine glory, call for Elijah's presence. The fiery chariot itself is a powerful symbol. In Elijah's ascension, chariots and horses, which were once symbols of power and the tools of kings and armies, become instruments of heaven. They mention an invisible but present heavenly army, serving as a reminder that God's power surrounds his people in ways that are not always apparent. Elisha saw the vision as proof that God and the prophets who carried his word were Israel's real strength, not its army of earthly warriors. Another layer is added by the whirlwind, which echoes past epiphanies in which the presence of God was made evident in wind and storm. Elijah's departure is a moment when heaven itself intervened in history in full display, as fire, chariot, horses, and whirlwind come together to create a tableau of divine majesty. Elijah's ascension offers humanity hope. For him, death, the universal end, was not the last chapter. His being carried alive into heaven provides a glimpse of a world beyond death and implies that God's power transcends even death. Because of this, his tale has endured through the ages, influencing both Jewish and Christian ideas. In the latter, Elijah is viewed as a metaphor for people who will not experience death, but will instead undergo a metamorphosis in God's presence at the end of time. Thus, his fiery departure is both a singular historical event and a symbolic assurance of what lies ahead. We are reminded of the human side of this incident by Elisha's sorrow mixed with wonder. It was a gift and a wound to see such glory. He had witnessed the burning of his master, but he was left behind to carry out a mission in a world still rife with injustice, idolatry, and resistance. The cost of leadership and the weight of filling a void left by someone bigger than himself are reflected in his tearing clothes. However, the mantle he carried demonstrated that God equips those he calls and that the work of heaven continues, even after a prophet leaves. Therefore, Elijah's ascension is about more than just glory and fire. It's also about the continuing tale of faith that those who remain carry on. Over the ages, the mystery surrounding Enoch and Elijah has always prompted the question, where did they go if they did not die? Both were taken, according to the scriptures, one in a flaming chariot and whirlwind, the other because he walked with God and was no more. These brief statements raise more questions than they do answers. Were they taken into God's very presence? Were they taken to a secret world beyond human understanding? Or are they still waiting for a last part in the redemption narrative? In an effort to look behind the curtain, ancient traditions, especially those found in Ethiopian texts and Jewish mysticism, describe radiant thrones, councils of angels, and layers of heavens where creatures like Enoch and Elijah might still reside. By providing us with a glimpse of dimensions that transcend the boundaries of human vision and realms beyond the material world, these descriptions deepen rather than resolve the mystery. Many Ethiopian and Jewish traditions view the heavens as a vast architecture of layers rather than a single cohesive space. Ethiopian copies of the Book of Enoch describe 7 heavens, each with its own mysteries. Radiant thrones shine with inaccessible light, rivers flow with fire, and angelic hosts serve in these stratified heavens. Angelic guides are said to have led Enoch through these worlds, showing him places where the righteous await their reward, where rebellious spirits are imprisoned in darkness, and where prayers ascend like incense. Many traditions hold that Enoch still lives in this cosmic geography, not in the afterlife, but rather in a light chamber set aside for those who are selected to stand near God's throne. As if his life had not ended, but had been elevated into service within the very council of heaven. His position as a heavenly scribe implies both presence and participation. Many people have similar ideas about Elijah's final destination. He was carried into heavenly realms beyond mortal sight by the fiery chariot, which is viewed as more than just a dramatic departure. He is portrayed in later Jewish texts as a messenger who continues to travel between heaven and earth, a person who hears the faithful's prayers and even shows up when they are in need. This adaptable role implies that Elijah's ascension was a metamorphosis into a being capable of existing in multiple realms rather than just a means of escaping death. According to Ethiopian customs, Elijah is one of the prophets who never stops. Standing in front of the throne, his fiery departure represents his unending intimacy with the God whose might is like consuming fire. The absence of death in Enoch and Elijah is not merely an omission, rather it is an elevation, as though God had claimed them for reasons that are beyond human comprehension. Where could such figures be found? Ethiopian depictions of the heavens show a multi-layered luminescent world akin to a huge palace. The first heaven is sometimes depicted as the world of the stars, where cosmic motions are closely monitored and directed. Places of flaming elements, rivers of ice and flame, thrones and courts where angelic beings administer justice are revealed at higher levels. The seventh heaven, the innermost chamber where God's throne gleams with glory greater than the sun, is located at the summit. Ethiopian texts state that Enoch was brought before the throne and changed into Metatron, the great scribe of heaven, who was clad in light and tasked with documenting the actions of both angels and men. If this is the case, then Enoch's disappearance was actually a relocation into the most sacred places in creation, where he was fully alive in the presence of God, but concealed from human view. It is thought that Elijah is also involved in this mystery. His flaming ascent appears to portend his unending proximity to the world of wind and flame that envelops the throne. According to later mystical traditions, Elijah occasionally shows up as a herald or guide, even paying visions to the righteous. A cup of wine is poured for Elijah on Passover, representing his anticipated return as a precursor to redemption, because in Jewish tradition he is so strongly associated with the invisible world. The idea behind this is straightforward. Since he never died, he could come back at any time and enter previously undiscovered spheres of human history. This idea is also maintained in Ethiopian Christianity, which emphasizes that Elijah's fiery chariot marked the start of a new life in which he will serve as a living example of God's might. The question of dimensions beyond human perception is also raised by the mystery of these hidden realms. The idea that reality is bigger than what we can see is echoed in ancient descriptions of layered heavens, despite their apparent symbolic meaning. The heavens may be dimensions folded around us, invisible yet present, much like the human eye only sees a small band of light, while the universe contains countless unseen wavelengths. Might Enoch and Elijah exist in such dimensions, alive but concealed, taking part in God's plan in ways that are incomprehensible to us? Their tales imply that the line separating heaven and earth is not as clear-cut as we think. The angelic escorts, the fiery chariot and the whirlwind are all indications that the invisible can enter the visible world and transport selected people into typically hidden realities. This mystery is further enlarged by the concept of heavenly. Councils. We get glimpses of divine assemblies in biblical texts like Job and Isaiah, where angels stand before God and give reports, receive orders, or declare glory. Perhaps their current existence is active rather than passive. If Elijah was carried up in fire and Enoch was changed into a heavenly scribe, they might be present at these councils, witnessing the drama of creation, acting as go-betweens, or getting ready for roles in God's unfolding plan. Therefore, their absence from earth could be a presence in heaven, their lives extended into a realm where cosmic and divine purposes are interwoven. The heavens are a huge living temple in Ethiopian mythology, with worship, order, and purpose permeating every stratum. Thinking of Enoch and Elijah in this temple is like thinking of them as a part of a perpetual liturgy, where the light never goes out and the praise never stops. However, their connection to humanity has never been broken. Both Elijah, who was raised because of his courage and fire, and Enoch, who was taken because he walked faithfully with God, continue to serve as links between the mortal and the immortal. They demonstrate how human flesh can transcend time and death when it is touched by divine power, allowing participants to become involved in mysteries that are beyond the purview of everyday life. We are left feeling a great sense of awe by this. Now, where are they? Since their stories are about destiny rather than geography, the exact location is concealed, possibly on purpose. They lead us to a world where devoted lives can be enmeshed in God's very life and where death does not have absolute power. Their secret worlds serve as a reminder that the cosmos is larger than we can perceive, that the heavens might be closer than we think, and that there are people who have lived on our planet before. Since their journeys imply that the invisible world is just as real as the earth beneath our feet, Enoch and Elijah stand as living reminders that humanity is not destined to decay alone, but rather to undergo transformation. A strange and potent vision that has sparked centuries of conjecture and interpretation can be found in the Book of Revelation. Two witnesses, dressed in sackcloth, will stand before the Lord of the earth in the last days, according to the Apostle John. Their presence is assertive and confrontational rather than subdued or symbolic. They prophesy against global corruption, speak authoritatively, and send out plagues as frequently as they feel like it. Their testimony shakes the nations, and fire flows from their mouths to devour those who attempt to harm them. This image is not abstract to many. It refers to actual people, and two names, Enoch and Elijah, recur repeatedly in Jewish and Christian thought throughout the ages. Many people think that these two men, whose lives ended without death, were saved for this last mission, to return at the end of time as God's chosen witnesses against the world's darkness. Given their distinct stories, it makes sense that Enoch and Elijah are the two witnesses. One important characteristic sets them apart from all other prophets and righteous men in the Bible: they never died. Although both were spared, death is the inevitable end and the shared fate of all people. According to Genesis, Enoch walked with God until he was no more, for God took him. Elijah was raised by a fiery chariot in a flurry, leaving Elisha in shock and sorrow. Their lives ended with divine removal rather than death. For many years, interpreters have inferred from this detail that they were kept for a later date, imprisoned in secret realms until their scheduled return. If everyone must experience death, then maybe their deaths are postponed rather than denied, saved for their part in the end times when their martyrdom will be the culmination of their testimony. The two witnesses' mission is vividly described in Revelation. Wearing sackcloth, a symbol of mourning and repentance, they will prophesy for 1,260 days. According to the prophet Zechariah, they are likened to two olive trees and two lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth and represent anointed ones who are filled with the Spirit. Their extraordinary power is reminiscent of Moses's and Elijah's ministries. During the days of their prophecy, they can block the sky to prevent rain. They have the power to cause plagues and turn water into blood. During this time, they are protected by divine authority, untouchable, and their words turn into weapons against those who disagree with them. Different theories have been based on this combination of imagery, but the most persistent belief is that the two people who never died, Elijah and Enoch, are meant to return and carry out this holy but terrifying mission. There is symbolic significance in the selection of Enoch and Elijah. Enoch, the seventh son of Adam and a man from before the flood, symbolizes the first human generations who lived in a corrupt world. When the world was drowning in immorality, he walked with God and became the messenger of judgment, alerting people to the imminence of God's justice. In contrast, Elijah lived during the reign of kings, a time when idolatry was on the rise in Israel. He challenged rulers who had abandoned God and stood up to false prophets. His very existence served as a warning to a people who had forgotten the covenant. He was the prophet of fire. Together they represent the apostate kingdom of Israel and the pre-disaster antediluvian world, two periods of rebellion against evil. Reviving them as the two witnesses would be a last stand against the corruption of the last era by fusing the fire of prophetic courage with the testimony of ancient faithfulness. Numerous early Christian authors recognize this link. Since Enoch and Elijah had not yet passed away, and Scripture states that it is appointed for man to die once, church fathers such as Tertullian and Hippolytus contended that they had to return. They reasoned that their deaths were still to come, and that Revelation's vision provided the backdrop. The beast from the abyss opposes the witnesses' prophecies before they are ultimately killed. While the world rejoices in their silence, their bodies lie in the great city for 3.5 days, exposed to mockery. But following this humiliation, they are vindicated when God gives them life, and they are able to stand and frighten their adversaries. As their adversaries look on, they ascend in a cloud as a voice from heaven calls. The themes of Enoch and Elijah's original lives being taken up, changed, and now entwined with the experience of death and resurrection are reflected in this sequence. Their function is to serve as a mirror of Christ's own triumph by bearing witness, suffering, and rising. The state of the last age is also addressed by the two witnesses' prophetic abilities. A world full of rebellion, where nations rebel against God and evil appears unchecked, is depicted in Revelation. The presence of two witnesses becomes a symbol of divine justice and mercy in this setting. Their message is confrontational rather than cozy. They serve as reminders that God's covenant is remembered and that truthful voices will always prevail over lies propagated by those in positions of authority. Their wonders serve as a reminder that God can still use creation to humble the arrogant, echoing the plagues of Egypt and the Israelite drought. In a way, their ministry turns into the last prophetic exhortation to turn from sin, the last opportunity for humanity to do so before the end of time. However, their goal is confrontation as well as warning. According to Revelation, the beast will emerge from the abyss to wage war on them and vanquish them. The apparent victory of evil over God's messengers is the story's climax. The nation's celebration of their deaths demonstrates the extent of the global uprising. It is a society so cynical that it takes pleasure in the suppression of truth. However, this triumph is short-lived because God's breath of life enters them 3.5 days later. Their resurrection serves as a judgment on their adversaries, as well as confirmation of their message. Their ascension completes the circle of their lives, mirroring how Enoch was taken in mystery and Elijah was carried in fire. After testifying, Their return to heaven implies that their mission has been accomplished, their role has been played out, and their deaths have been assimilated into the larger scheme of God's justice. Faith communities are still shaped by the expectation of their return. According to Jewish tradition, Elijah is still anticipated as the Messiah's herald, showing up before the Lord's great and terrible day. The connection between Enoch and Elijah and the two witnesses offers a framework for comprehending God's actions in the last days according to Christian eschatology. Their experiences serve as a reminder to believers that God always preserves voices of truth, that no darkness is final, and that his witnesses will rise again, even if the world rejects them. Some see their impending return as a sign that justice will ultimately triumph and that God has not abandoned his creation, as well as a prophecy of judgment and hope. The persistence of divine purpose is symbolized by Enoch and Elijah, who have been preserved for millennia. Their reappearance as the two witnesses is related to both testimony and punishment. They are the embodiment of courage that refused to bow, faith that refused to compromise, and lives that were raised above the grave. Their appearance at the end of times will represent the final conflict between the truth of heaven and the rebellion of earth, a final affirmation that God's plan is not yet complete. Their names continue to inspire creativity and faith, serving as a reminder that the same God who took them will also bring them back when the final chapter of history is written. Since the dawn of time, death has appeared to be an inevitable fact, a fate that unites both kings and commoners. However, Enoch and Elijah stand out in the Bible as exceptions to this general rule. In contrast to everyone else, they were brought straight into God's presence and did not experience the afterlife. Their ascensions carry layers of significance that reverberate throughout the ages, rather than being arbitrary or isolated miracles. They are more than just isolated tales of salvation. They are symbols ingrained in human history that impart knowledge of God's omnipotence, unending hope, and the secrets of his purpose for humanity. It is impossible to exaggerate how unique their experiences are. These two serve as evidence that God is not constrained by the laws of nature in a world where even the most revered prophets eventually perished. Their exclusion from mortality raises the possibility that heaven made the conscious decision to show that the Creator has control over even the finality of death. God shows that he has the power to change what people consider to be inevitable by saving them from death. Death may rule the world, but it is not final. This provides believers with a glimpse into eternity and demonstrates how far beyond human understanding God's purposes are. The concept of divine preservation serves as the foundation for the symbolism of their ascension. Elijah stood as a fire prophet during a period of rebellion, and Enoch walked in faithfulness with God. Their departure from earth demonstrated that God does not forget those who are his, and their lives became vehicles of testimony. In addition to being a reward, keeping them alive serves as a reminder that faith is never in vain. God raised these men to demonstrate that he watches over his own and that the faithful are never left behind, even in the face of overwhelming darkness during a time when corruption and despair dominated the world. Their stories are a river of hope. The stories of Enoch and Elijah held an implicit promise for those who had to deal with suffering, exile, and mortality on a daily basis. Death is not the end. God must have a plan to defeat death for all of his people if he could raise these men from the dead without their suffering. Their ascensions were early indications of resurrection, hints of the larger truth that life with God is not limited by death. The message is unmistakable. The Creator is stronger than death, and those who hold fast to him will experience something more glorious than the finality of dust turning into dust. However, the lessons don't end with the promise of eternal life. Their tales also show faith and bravery in a world that is frequently inimical to the truth. Despite growing up in a corrupt generation, Enoch followed God until his path led him to the heavens. In a kingdom shattered by idolatry, Elijah defied rulers, false god prophets, and the pressure of the masses. The fact that both were taken without experiencing death implies that heaven does not disregard bravery in faith. Their lives demonstrate that when both men and women bravely stand up for what is right, they are joining a timeless narrative that transcends the difficulties of the present. We witness a spectacular demonstration of divine power during Elijah's fiery ascension. It is more than just a breathtaking sight to see a chariot of fire and burning horses carry him into the whirlwind. It is a statement. Scripture frequently uses fire as a metaphor for God's presence and purity, devouring everything. That is untrue. Therefore, Elijah's ascension signifies not only his departure, but also the revelation of divine majesty, confirming that heaven had sealed his prophetic mission. It shows that when their mission is accomplished, God's servants are drawn into divine glory rather than being constrained to earthly ends. In contrast, Enoch's silent departure represents closeness and a secret. He simply was no more because God took him. This moment's simplicity reflects a profound truth. Walking faithfully with God is a path that leads directly into his presence. No fiery chariot blazed across the sky. Enoch's silent departure serves as a reminder that not all of God's actions are cloaked in spectacle, whereas Elijah's departure echoed through history. Silence can sometimes reveal divine glory, and the silent raising of the faithful into eternal. Communion is the greatest miracle. These two ascensions work together to create a harmonious image. Enoch represents the secret personal mystery of God's proximity, while Elijah represents the outward, flaming manifestation of divine victory. Both convey the same message. God is in control of both life and death. One is loud and public, while the other is quiet and private. The dual witness gives believers today comfort in knowing that God sees and protects those who are his, regardless of whether our journey is full of dramatic encounters or peaceful daily walks of faith. The message was not just about two men. It was about the fate of all the faithful, for the early communities that kept these customs alive. God could raise the righteous on the last day if he could take Enoch and Elijah. Their ascensions portend transformation and resurrection. They serve as markers for a time when humanity will no longer be ruled by death. Remembering Enoch and Elijah is a reminder that life is temporary, that history is curved toward rebirth, and that God's story ends in restoration rather than decay. Their tales inspire modern believers to live differently in the here and now, even beyond the assurances of life after death. Elijah stood for truth in a country full of idols, and Enoch walked with God in a time of corruption. Their bravery demonstrates that faith is active rather than passive, necessitating defiance in the face of a world that is averse to compromise. Walking with God means defying cultural norms, speaking up when it's easier to keep quiet, and having faith when fear makes us want to run away. Their resurrections serve as a reminder that the same God who kept them alive will give us the strength to endure in our own generation. Additionally, the symbolism suggests divine mystery. Why only these two men were selected for such remarkable departures is beyond anyone's comprehension. Maybe it's because their missions are still unfinished, or maybe God wanted to remind people that his ways are not constrained by the laws of nature. Whatever the cause, there is significance in the fact that their ascensions are inexplicable. It teaches that having faith necessitates humility and the readiness to acknowledge that not all answers will be provided and that not all things are revealed. Instead of weakening faith, mystery strengthens it, by enticing us to put more faith in the one whose wisdom is greater than our comprehension. Ultimately, the significance of Enoch and Elijah's ascensions extends well beyond their own lives. They are woven into the vast fabric of God's revelation rather than existing as isolated anomalies. They give us a glimpse of God's might over death, His dedication to protecting the faithful, His inspiration for bravery and faith, and His developing plan of resurrection and rebirth. They serve as a reminder that humanity's story is not limited to the afterlife, but rather is rooted in eternity, where life triumphs over death, and the faithful are raised into the presence of the one who called them by name. We frequently assume that the Bible we own contains all of the revelation that God intended for humanity when we look at the scriptures that the majority of the world recognizes today. History, however, reveals that the choice of which texts would be kept and which would be abandoned was made by councils, politics, and human judgment. One notable example of what was left behind is the Ethiopian Bible. Its 88 volumes preserve works that were purposefully left out of the Western canon, such as Jubilees, the Book of Enoch, and other writings that contain remarkable revelations about angels, creation, and divine judgment. One must follow the conflict between tradition and authority, between the need to control religious narratives and the desire for simplicity, in order to comprehend why only Ethiopia preserved these writings. The decision to exclude the Book of Enoch from the Western canon was motivated by both human fear and theological caution. It was praised by early church fathers like Tertullian and Clement of Alexandria, who saw its visions and prophecies as genuine and inspired. Even the New Testament makes direct allusions to Enoch, especially in the letter of Jude, which quotes the ancient prophet. Centuries later, councils decided it was too risky and too full of secrets about angels, gods, and the inner workings of creation. Its visions might have been too odd or too illuminating for a church that aimed for consistency and order. In order to prevent Enoch from influencing European Christians' imaginations, the Western Church had subtly pushed him aside by the 4th century. However, these rulings had no effect on Ethiopia. Rooted in its own traditions and protected by geography, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserved Enoch as sacred scripture. For them, it was always an essential component of God's revelation rather than a marginal text. The Ethiopian Bible provides a glimpse of what Christianity looked like before the hammer of councils destroyed some books in favor of others, along with other works that are not allowed in the West. Its survival is not just a coincidence. Rather, it is evidence of how God makes sure that some truths endure despite efforts by human beings to bury them. For centuries, Enoch's teachings about heavenly journeys, disobedient angels, and the hidden layers of creation reverberated throughout the Ethiopian highlands. These texts are important because they deepen our comprehension of the invisible. For instance, the Watchers, a group of angels who descended to earth, disobeyed divine order, and corrupted humanity by disclosing forbidden knowledge, are vividly described in the Book of Enoch. Violence, idolatry, and perversions were brought into the world by their rebellion. In addition to explaining the beginning of evil, Enoch's account of these beings' fall frames the cosmic conflict between light and darkness in a way that is far more expansive than what is preserved by the Western canon alone. The creation and flood stories in Genesis seem short and unfinished without Enoch, leaving holes in the story. These voids are filled by Enoch, and people start to realize how intricately the earth and heavens are connected. The Book of Jubilees, which recounts the early stories of Genesis in greater detail, is also preserved in the Ethiopian Bible. It contains an accurate calendar, a well-organized description of angelic roles, and justifications for how human decisions influence the divine order. With an emphasis on cosmic order and divine justice, this text presents an organized view of history. When combined with Enoch, it paints a picture of creation as a stage where human and angelic destinies collide, rather than as a straightforward beginning. Much of this cosmic depth was lost when such writings were excluded from the West, giving believers a more limited understanding of creation than that of previous generations. The enlarged perspective of angels is among the most revolutionary aspects that are still present in these writings. Angels appear in the Western canon as warriors, messengers, or protectors, but their functions are never made clear. They are given names, responsibilities, and histories in the Ethiopian texts. Instead of appearing as remote, anonymous characters, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel are active participants in God's plan who protect creation, step in to help humans, and even impart holy truths. The Watchers' rebellion and their subsequent punishment highlight the seriousness of angelic authority, reminding us that even celestial beings are subject to judgment. The heavens are no longer an abstract concept to those who study these texts. Rather, they are a place of order, struggle, and purpose, inhabited by creatures whose fates are similar to those of humanity. Another theme that emerges more clearly in these preserved texts is divine judgment. The Ethiopian scriptures offer in-depth depictions of how God strikes a balance between justice and mercy, whereas the Western canon emphasizes judgment in general terms: the flood, the destruction of Sodom, the prophet's warnings. Enoch depicts the great heavenly tablets that record deeds, the thrones of judgment that weigh humans and angels, and the fiery punishments that are ready for those who disobey the divine order. These descriptions are meant to show that God's justice is exacting, that nothing eludes his notice, and that the final reckoning is both inevitable and righteous, not just to arouse fear. These hidden books transform everything for those who want to comprehend the Ascension stories. Enoch and Elijah's ascensions are now seen as a part of a greater fabric of divine activity, rather than as singular miracles. Being taken to heaven becomes a major theme in Enoch's writings, not only as a personal benefit, but also as a cosmic requirement. Enoch recounts his own metamorphosis into a celestial scribe who is seated with angels and given access to divine secrets. His ascension involves more than just avoiding death. It involves carrying out a duty in the eternal order and serving as a judge and witness among the angels. His departure from earth might have seemed like a strange mystery without these writings, but with them, it becomes a crucial component in comprehending how God connects heaven and earth through humanity. These texts also shed light on Elijah's fiery departure. The fire and whirlwind that lift him are not arbitrary symbols in Ethiopian tradition. Rather, they are a part of a larger language of divine presence. Fire is a metaphor for God's cleansing force, his unstoppable whirlwind. Elijah's story is given depth by the Ethiopian Bible's preservation of books like Enoch, which implies that his ascension is about more than just escaping death. Rather, it's about entering the same heavenly realm that Enoch detailed in great detail. The two ascension tales together create a pattern and serve as evidence that people are meant for glory rather than dust, for communion with God rather than silence. These texts' inclusion in the Ethiopian Bible forces us to consider challenging issues. In the West, why were they not allowed? Was it an effort to manipulate theological interpretation, fear of their mysteries, or worry about their complexity? For whatever reason, their absence has left a large portion of Christianity lacking. Their preservation by the Ethiopian Church serves as a remedy, serving as a reminder that God's truth is not always limited to the decisions made by councils and leaders. Truth can occasionally endure in the periphery, thanks to communities that are unwilling to part with the assets entrusted to them. For contemporary readers, rediscovering these works is akin to discovering a secret library, a wealth of knowledge, just waiting to be unlocked. They add depth to well-known tales and reveal aspects of the divine that Western Christianity frequently ignores, rather than contradicting the well-known scriptures. They demonstrate that God's plan is more expansive than tradition has neatly framed, and that his interactions with people are more intricate, enigmatic, and breathtaking than we can fathom. The Ethiopian Bible challenges us to look beyond the ordinary and see the heavens as a reality full of voices, visions, and truths that bring us nearer to the Creator who is still speaking by clinging to these hidden writings. The tales of Enoch and Elijah, two men who never experienced death and who were raised into the heavens in ways that no other mortal has, stand out as twin pillars of mystery through the pages of Scripture and the echoes of ancient traditions. Are they still alive? Today, hidden from human view, but present in ways we cannot see? That is the question that lingers, the question that has been whispered over centuries. For thousands of years, believers have been enthralled with this mystery, and the notion that two men can live forever beyond the grasp of time and deterioration still inspires awe and hope. Their survival is regarded as an indisputable fact in Judaism. According to Jewish texts, Elijah is still a living person who occasionally disguises himself to protect the faithful, console the weary, or lead the lost. As a distinguished guest who represents hope that God's promises are remembered, he is thought to visit Passover tables. In Jewish mysticism, Enoch is also regarded as the man who became the heavenly scribe, documenting the actions of both humans and angels. He did not just disappear into heaven. Rather, he continues to play a divine role at the center of God's throne, as evidenced by his metamorphosis into the angel Metatron. When taken as a whole, they symbolize the potential for elevating, preserving, and weaving humanity into eternity. This mystery is carried forward with even greater ferocity in Christianity. Enoch and Elijah have long been associated with the New Testament's enigmatic allusions to the two witnesses in Revelation 11, which has led to the notion that they are still alive and are just waiting for the right moment to return and testify in front of the entire world. Their ongoing existence is not only a mystery to innumerable believers, but also a promise, a testament that the truths found in God's word regarding life, death, and resurrection are far more profound than human understanding. They are regarded as guardians of the future, saved by God for the very pinnacle of history, rather than as ghosts of the past. Their tales demonstrate that God's might can defy the laws of mortality itself, and that death is not the only fate predestined for humans. These individuals are revered in Islam as well. Elijah, also called Ilyas, is regarded as a prophet who was exalted by God and kept alive for a longer period of time than the average person. The Quran describes Enoch, who is frequently linked to Idris, as a man of truth who has been elevated to a high position. According to Islamic traditions, these men were unique. Their fates differed from those of regular mortals, and their survival is a part of the divine mystery that permeates creation. The notion that two men were taken alive, preserved by God, and remain hidden in the invisible realms of existence is thus the commonality among the three greatest religions in the world. What does it signify for us today, though? Enoch and Elijah are more than just historical figures if they are still alive. They are living proof that God has control over death, defenders of faith, and observers of history. Maybe they are among us without being seen, seeing how nations come and go, how people waver between faith and doubt, and how the world groans under corruption while still longing for salvation. Every weary soul is reassured by their presence that death does not have the last say, and that people who walk with God may find life where no one else believed it was possible. When we reflect on the hardships of our own era, they're invisible. Guardianship assumes emotional significance. The picture painted by wars, injustice, moral decay, and despair is not all that dissimilar from the times they were accustomed to. Despite living in a world that was falling apart due to the violence of the Nephilim and the corruption of the Watchers, Enoch remained obedient and was taken to heaven. Elijah faced an idolatrous nation where prophets of Baal had deceived the populace, but he stood his ground and was swept away in flames. The challenges they faced back then are similar to those we face today, and if they persevered and were saved, their lives serve as a constant reminder that God still inspires bravery in people, rewards loyalty, and has the ability to lift us out of the depths of despair. They are frequently described in mystic traditions as present in subtle ways, rather than as absent. Some claim that Elijah still shows up at pivotal times to protect the defenseless or console the dying. There are many tales of strangers who come with words of hope and then disappear, leaving the impression that something divine has gone by. Enoch is also viewed as a person who is still active, watching over heaven's records and making sure that justice is served. These customs, whether literal or symbolic, preserve the idea that we are never truly alone and that there are people watching, waiting, and possibly getting ready for the day when they will once more enter the past. One of the biggest mysteries still surrounds their place in God's plan. They will reappear as witnesses in the last days, opposing the powers of evil, proclaiming the truth in front of nations, and finally sealing their testimony with their lives if the prophecy of Revelation comes to pass. God's design is astounding. When you consider that two men who never died will return to face death and yet rise again. It teaches us that life is not linear and that God is able to restore, change, and preserve in ways that are incomprehensible to us. There is hope and anticipation in the fact that their story is not yet complete. What hope does that give us then, if two men can avoid death? This is the last emotional question that remains, one that goes beyond curiosity and touches the heart. It teaches us that death is not a prison and that people who follow God can find life where others can only find death. It informs us that resurrection is a reality rather than merely a theory, as hinted at by Enoch and Elijah's own lives. Their ongoing presence, concealed but genuine, foreshadows the hope that death itself will eventually be reversed. Take a moment to think if this exploration of their stories has touched you. In order for us to continue solving these mysteries together, please subscribe to Bible Says and assist us in reaching 10,000 subscribers. Tell your friends about this video so that more people are aware of the hope these two men's lives hold. If you want to help keep this work going, please support the channel by giving it a super thanks. Tell us your name, city, and thoughts about the story of Enoch and Elijah in the comments section. Is it possible that they are still alive, observing, and anticipating their return? This is just the beginning, so stay with us. We will delve deeper into the Ethiopian Bible's hidden books in future videos, revealing the mysteries of angels, heaven, and the end times. The journey goes on, and the mystery is immense. For the time being, keep in mind that Enoch and Elijah are alive, and their tales serve as a reminder that God's plan is far more expansive than the passing of time, and that His promises are stronger than death. What if I told you that within the pages of ancient scripture lies a secret that defies everything we know about human existence? What if there were two men, real men, not myths, who never tasted death, who were taken from this earth alive, and entered into the very heavens while still in their mortal bodies? Imagine standing in their place, feeling the pull of the earth release, and watching the sky open up as you ascend into realms no living person has ever returned to describe. This is not the stuff of fantasy. It is a story preserved in the oldest records of humanity, woven into the fabric of the Bible and echoed in Ethiopian traditions that claim to hold forgotten truths hidden from the rest of the world. These two figures, Elijah and Enoch, are remembered not as ordinary men, but as witnesses to a mystery that challenges the way we think about life, death, and what may exist beyond the grave. Their ascensions are like cracks in the veil that separates heaven from earth, windows into a reality where death does not have the final word. To understand their stories, we must first step back from our ordinary way of thinking. Today, science chases immortality through technology, medicine, and theories of life extension. Billionaires fund research into prolonging youth, and entire industries thrive on the human desire to escape aging. Yet thousands of years before modern laboratories or futuristic dreams, two men are said to have achieved something far greater. They did not simply live long lives. They were carried directly into the presence of God. Their very existence becomes a question mark placed against the certainty of human mortality. The first of these men, Enoch, appears in the earliest chapters of Genesis, at a time when the world was still raw and untamed. He is described as a man who walked so closely with God that one day he was no longer found among the living. The words are brief, almost elusive, and Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. That short line holds within it a world of wonder. No details of illness, no funeral, no return to dust, just an unexplainable departure. In later writings, especially in the Ethiopian tradition preserved in the Book of Enoch, his story is expanded, painting him as a man entrusted with visions of heaven, secrets of the angels, and glimpses of divine judgment. It is as if he was taken away because earth could no longer contain the knowledge he carried. The second figure is Elijah, a prophet who lived centuries later, during a time of corruption, idolatry, and the struggle of Israel to remain faithful. Elijah's life was fiery, filled with confrontations against kings and false prophets. But his end, or rather his transition, is unlike anything seen in Scripture. He does not die quietly in bed or fall to the sword of his enemies. Instead, his disciple Elisha witnesses him being lifted up into the heavens by a whirlwind, accompanied by a chariot and horses of fire. One moment, Elijah was walking the dusty road of earth, and the next he was gone, swallowed by the sky in a blaze of glory. For Elisha, it must have been both terrifying and breathtaking, watching a human body depart the realm of mortality in a storm of divine fire. What unites the stories of these two men is not just their escape from death, but the mystery of why they were chosen. Why Enoch? Why Elijah? Were they preserved for a purpose beyond their own lifetimes? Some traditions suggest they were taken as witnesses to return in the final days, testifying once more before humanity at the climax of history. Others believe their ascensions are symbols of hope, that human beings were never meant for death, but for life everlasting, and these two are living proof of that hidden promise. The Ethiopian Bible, with its 88 books, holds these stories with a weight and reverence often lost in Western traditions. It does not treat them as side notes or mere curiosities, but as essential threads in the story of God's dealings with humanity. Within these ancient texts, Elijah and Enoch are not forgotten. They are remembered as men who remind us that death is not the only doorway. And when we turn to the Book of Enoch, preserved in Ethiopia for centuries while excluded from most Western canons, the veil lifts even higher. There, Enoch's heavenly journey is described in detail, his visions of the throne of God, the secrets of creation, the ranks of angels, and the fate of both righteous and wicked souls. Reading it feels like standing on the threshold of heaven itself, guided by the footsteps of a man who never died. When we think of immortality today, we think of science fiction or far-off dreams. But for the people who preserved these stories, immortality was not a dream, it was history. Enoch and Elijah were not inventions, but real figures whose lives broke the pattern of birth, life, and death. They stand as exceptions that demand explanation, and in that demand, they push us to consider, what if humanity's destiny is greater than the grave? What if the breath within us